I never thought I would end up in a legal battle with my own neighborhood association. But when I found that yellow envelope tucked into my mailbox on a freezing January morning in Columbus, Ohio, my blood pressure shot through the roof faster than a snowplow could clear a street, which is ironic considering what happened next. The fine was for $300. $300 for failing to shovel my sidewalk within 24 hours of snowfall. I stood there in my driveway, breath forming clouds in the bitter air, staring at the citation signed by none other than Patricia Hendricks, the president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. The paper trembled in my gloved hands, not from the cold but from pure rage. My sidewalk was shoveled. I had cleared it myself at 6 in the morning, 2 hours after the snow stopped falling. But what really made my jaw clench was the simple fact that my entire street, Oakwood Drive, remained buried under 8 inches of compacted snow and ice because the HOA plow had never bothered to come down our way. Meanwhile, Patricia and the rest of the board members who lived on Maple Crest, the street that formed the northern boundary of our subdivision, had enjoyed not 1 but 2 full plowing services. I knew this because my neighbor, Frank Morrison, had driven past there on his way to work and sent me photos showing their pristine, salt-treated roads while the rest of us were playing demolition derby, just trying to get our cars out of our driveways. My name is Oliver Thompson, and I am a 34-year-old software engineer who moved to Meadowbrook Hills 3 years ago because the schools were good and the neighborhood seemed quiet. I should have known better when the realtor spent 15 minutes talking about the active and engaged HOA. Active and engaged turned out to be code for invasive and tyrannical, but I had been too focused on the granite countertops and the finished basement to read between the lines. I called the HOA office immediately. The phone rang 6 times before a bored-sounding woman picked up. Meadowbrook Hills HOA, this is Denise speaking. This is Oliver Thompson on Oakwood Drive. I just received a fine for not shoveling my sidewalk, but I did shovel it. And more importantly, my street has not been plowed even once while Maple Crest has been done twice. Can you explain that? There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. Let me pull up your file. Okay, Mr. Thompson, the fine was issued because our compliance officer drove by at 2 in the afternoon and documented snow accumulation on your walkway. That's impossible. I shoveled at 6 in the morning and again at noon because some snow had blown back. There's no way there was enough accumulation to violate any bylaws. I'm just reading what's in the system, sir. If you want to dispute the fine, you'll need to submit a written appeal to the board. Fine. And what about the plowing issue? Why hasn't Oakwood Drive been touched? Another pause, longer this time. I don't have information about plowing schedules. You would need to speak to Mrs. Hendricks about that. Then transfer me to her. She's not available right now. You can leave a message or send an email. I hung up before I said something I would regret and immediately pulled out my phone to take photos of my perfectly clear sidewalk. Then I walked down Oakwood Drive, documenting the untouched street, the snow packed so hard that tire tracks had formed icy ruts down the middle. My neighbor Maria Garcia was outside trying to chip ice away from her mailbox. Did you get one too? I called out. She looked up, her face red from exertion and cold. A fine. Yes, $250 for me. This is ridiculous, Oliver. My husband threw out his back shoveling yesterday, and now they want to charge us for not doing it fast enough. I'm fighting this, I said. This is discrimination or negligence or something. We pay the same HOA fees as everyone else, but we're not getting the same services. Maria nodded vigorously. Count me in. My cousin is a lawyer. I'll give her a call. Over the next 2 days, I discovered that 9 households on Oakwood Drive had received similar fines, ranging from $200 to $400 depending on the supposed severity of the violation. Meanwhile, Maple Crest and the 2 other streets where board members lived, Birchwood Lane and Willow Court, had all been plowed multiple times. I started a group chat with the affected residents and began compiling evidence. Frank Morrison provided his dated photographs. Jennifer Wu, who lived 4 houses down from me, had a doorbell camera that showed her shoveling her walk at 5:30 in the morning, a full 30 minutes before the snow even stopped. Thomas Keller, a retired postal worker, had been keeping meticulous records of the plowing schedule for the past 2 winters because he had suspected favoritism for months. His spreadsheets were beautiful, color-coded evidence of a pattern that was impossible to deny. I drafted a formal appeal letter, attached all the evidence, and emailed it to the HOA board on Thursday evening. By Friday afternoon, I had received a terse response from Patricia Hendricks herself. "Mr. Thompson, your appeal has been reviewed and denied." The fines were issued in accordance with our bylaws, specifically Section 7.3, which requires all sidewalks and walkways to be cleared within 24 hours of snowfall cessation. Our compliance officer's documentation is considered accurate and binding. Regarding the plowing schedule, the association contracts with an outside company that prioritizes streets based on traffic volume and safety considerations. Maple Crest is a main thoroughfare and therefore receives priority service. Your fee is due within 30 days to avoid additional penalties. Regards, Patricia Hendricks, HOA President. I read the email 3 times, each time feeling my anger build. Maple Crest was not a main thoroughfare. It was a residential street exactly like mine, with the same number of houses, the same speed limit, and the same amount of traffic. The only difference was that Patricia lived there, along with 2 other board members. That evening, I attended my first HOA board meeting. The meetings were held in the community center, a bland building with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that hummed like angry wasps. About 20 residents were scattered across the folding chairs, and I recognized several faces from my street. The board sat at a table at the front. Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her mid-50s with shoulder-length blonde hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Dale Morrison, the treasurer, a nervous man who kept adjusting his glasses. And Susan Chen, the secretary, who seemed more interested in her phone than the proceedings. Patricia called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of a gavel that seemed unnecessarily dramatic. "Good evening, everyone. We'll begin with old business, then move to new business and finally open the floor to resident comments. Each speaker will have 3 minutes." The old business consisted of approving the previous meeting's minutes and discussing a proposal to install new lighting near the playground. Everything was voted through quickly, with Patricia dominating the conversation and the other 2 board members nodding along like bobbleheads. When they finally reached resident comments, I was the first person to stand. "Oliver Thompson, Oakwood Drive," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I'm here to discuss the discriminatory plowing practices and the unjust fines that have been levied against residents of my street." Patricia's smile tightened. "Mr. Thompson, if this is about your appeal, that matter has been resolved." "It hasn't been resolved. It's been dismissed without proper consideration." 9 residents on Oakwood Drive received fines for allegedly not shoveling their sidewalks, despite evidence that we all complied with the bylaws. Meanwhile, our street has not been plowed a single time this winter, while Maple Crest has been plowed twice after every snowfall. That's not prioritization based on safety. That's favoritism, and it's a violation of our rights as dues-paying members of this association. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several people pulled out their phones, some apparently looking up the bylaws, others possibly taking notes. Patricia set down her gavel carefully. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your frustration, but you're making serious accusations without understanding how the association operates. The plowing company makes decisions based on their professional assessment. We don't dictate their route. Then why does the contract specify that all streets should receive equal service?" I pulled out a printed copy of the snow removal section from our HOA contract, which I had obtained from the county recorder's office that afternoon. Section 12.4 states, and I quote, "The contractor shall provide snow removal services to all streets within the community boundaries in a timely and equitable manner." There's nothing here about priority streets or traffic volume. Patricia's face flushed slightly. That's a general guideline. The specifics are worked out with the contractor. Then I'd like to see those specifics. I'd like to see the actual operational agreement with the plowing company. Those documents are internal HOA business, not if they affect how my dues are being spent. Under Ohio law, specifically Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.03, homeowners have the right to inspect HOA financial records and contracts. I'm formally requesting access to the snow removal contract and the plowing schedules for the past 2 winters. The room had gone completely silent. Patricia's smile had vanished entirely. Dale looked like he wanted to crawl under the table, and Susan had finally looked up from her phone, her eyes wide. "You'll need to submit that request in writing," Patricia said, her voice clipped. "I'll have it to you by tomorrow morning. And I'll expect a response within the statutory 14 days. I sat down, my heart pounding. Frank, who was sitting behind me, leaned forward and whispered, "That was incredible." The meeting continued, but the energy had shifted. 2 other residents stood up to complain about the plowing, and one woman from Cedar Ridge, another neglected street, mentioned that she had also received a fine, despite photographic evidence of a clear sidewalk. Patricia moved through the rest of the agenda with visible irritation, cutting people off and rushing votes. When I got home that night, I found another yellow envelope in my mailbox. This one informed me that my appeal had been escalated to a formal hearing, scheduled for 3 weeks away, and that I would be required to present my case in person. Failure to attend would result in the fine doubling and potential legal action for non-payment. It was clearly meant to be intimidating, but all it did was steel my resolve. Over the following week, I threw myself into research. I learned everything I could about HOA law in Ohio, about fiduciary duties, about breach of contract, and about selective enforcement. I joined online forums where people shared their HOA horror stories, and I connected with a lawyer named Margaret Chen, who specialized in homeowner association disputes. She agreed to review my case for a consultation fee, and after looking over my evidence, she was blunt. "You have a strong case for selective enforcement and breach of contract," she said during our video call. "The plowing issue is clear-cut. If the HOA is providing services to some streets and not others without a legitimate reason, that's a violation of their duty to treat all members fairly. The fines are more complicated because they can argue they're just enforcing the rules, but the timing and the targeting of one specific street suggests improper motive. What should I do? Document everything. Get more evidence if you can. At the hearing, be professional but firm. Don't let them intimidate you. And if they rule against you anyway, which they might because they're judging their own case, You'll need to decide if you want to take this further. You could file a complaint with the Ohio Real Estate Commission if any board members have conflicts of interest, or you could pursue this in small claims court. What are the chances of winning in court? Margaret tilted her head thoughtfully. Based on what you've shown me, I'd say 70-30 in your favor. Maybe better if you can prove the board members knowingly diverted services to their own streets. How would I prove that? You'd need internal communications. Emails, texts, meeting minutes that aren't public. The smoking gun would be something showing they told the plowing company to prioritize certain streets for personal reasons. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my laptop screen. Getting that kind of evidence seemed impossible unless someone on the inside decided to talk. But then I remembered Denise, the bored-sounding woman who had answered the phone. She was the HOA office administrator, and while she clearly didn't care much about her job, she also hadn't seemed particularly loyal to Patricia. It was a long shot, but I decided to visit the HOA office in person. The office was located in a small commercial plaza about 2 miles from the neighborhood, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service. Inside, the space was cramped and cluttered, with filing cabinets lining one wall and a desk covered in paperwork. Denise sat behind the desk, a woman in her early 60s with gray hair and reading glasses on a chain. She looked up when I entered, recognition flickering across her face. "You're the guy who called about the fine," she said. "Oliver Thompson. I wanted to follow up in person." She sighed and gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Look, I'm going to level with you. I just work here. I don't make the decisions and I don't get paid enough to care about the politics. I understand. I'm not here to make your life difficult. I'm just trying to figure out what's really going on with the plowing situation." Denise studied me for a moment, then glanced at the door as if checking that no one was coming. "Patricia runs this place like her personal fiefdom. She's been president for 6 years, and nobody challenges her because she makes life hell for anyone who tries. The plowing thing, that's been an issue for 2 winters now. The company we used to use went out of business, and Patricia chose the new one without getting bids from anyone else. Her nephew owns the company." My eyes widened. "Her nephew, Brandon Hendricks. He started the plowing business 2 years ago, right around the time we needed a new contractor. Convenient, right? And yeah, he plows Maple Crest first and most often because that's where Patricia lives. She calls him directly whenever there's snow and tells him to make sure her street is clear before he does anything else." "You have proof of that?" Denise hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing I can give you without losing my job, but I'm telling you that's what happens. Brandon charges us premium rates, does half the work, and Patricia looks the other way because he's family. That's a conflict of interest. She should have recused herself from that decision. Should have, didn't. Like I said, nobody challenges her. Would you be willing to testify to this if it came to a legal proceeding?" Denise laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And end up blacklisted from every HOA job in Columbus? No thanks. I'm sorry, I really am, but I've got rent to pay." I thanked her for her time and left, my mind racing. A nepotism scandal would be huge, but without documentation or testimony, it would be hard to prove. I needed to find Brandon Hendricks and see what I could learn about his company. A quick Google search revealed that Brandon's company was called Hendricks Snow Services, LLC, and it had been registered with the state in November of 2023. The business address was a residential property in Westerville, about 20 minutes from Meadowbrook Hills. I drove by that weekend and found a small house with a pickup truck and a plow attachment parked in the driveway. The truck had the company name painted on the side in crooked letters that looked homemade. I knocked on the door, and a young man in his late 20s answered, wearing sweatpants and a stained t-shirt. He had Patricia's narrow eyes and sharp chin. "Brandon Hendricks?" I asked. "Yeah, who's asking?" "My name is Oliver Thompson. I live in Meadowbrook Hills, one of your clients." His expression shifted to guarded. "If this is about plowing, you need to take that up with the HOA. They tell me where to go." "That's actually exactly what I wanted to talk about. Do you have a priority system for which streets you plow first?" Like I said, talk to the HOA. I just follow their instructions. "So Patricia Hendricks tells you which streets to prioritize." Brandon's jaw tightened. "I'm not discussing my business operations with some random resident. If you have complaints, go through proper channels." "I am going through proper channels. I'm trying to understand why the HOA is paying for services that aren't being provided equally to all residents, especially when there might be a conflict of interest involved." "You need to leave," Brandon said, starting to close the door. I put my hand up but didn't touch the door. "Just answer me this. How many times have you plowed Oakwood Drive this winter?" "I don't keep track of individual streets." "Really? Because you seem to keep very good track of Maple Crest, considering you've plowed it twice after every single snowfall. That's your aunt's street, isn't it?" Brandon's face flushed red. "Get off my property before I call the cops." He slammed the door, and I walked back to my car, actually feeling optimistic for the first time in days. His reaction had told me everything I needed to know. He was following Patricia's instructions, and he knew it was wrong. Back at home, I filed a formal request with the Ohio Secretary of State for all public records related to Hendricks Snow Services, LLC. I also submitted my written request to the HOA for access to the snow removal contract and related documents. Then, I reached out to every resident I could find who had been affected by the plowing disparity or who had received questionable fines. By the time my hearing date arrived, I had compiled a 60-page dossier of evidence. I had photographs, doorbell camera footage, Thomas Keller's spreadsheets, copies of the HOA bylaws and the Ohio Revised Code sections that were relevant, screenshots of weather reports showing exact snowfall times, and a detailed map of the neighborhood color coded to show which streets had been plowed and how many times. The hearing was held in the same community center conference room, but this time it was just me, the 3 board members, and a court reporter that Patricia had hired, probably to make the proceedings seem more official and intimidating. I had dressed in a suit and tie, and I carried my evidence in a leather portfolio that had been a gift from my parents when I graduated college. Patricia sat at the center of the table, with Dale and Susan flanking her. They all had copies of my original appeal letter, but I could tell from the pristine state of the papers that they hadn't actually read it carefully. "Mr. Thompson," Patricia began, her voice dripping with false courtesy, "thank you for attending this hearing. We've reviewed your appeal, and we're prepared to hear any additional information you'd like to present. However, I want to remind you that this board's decision is final, and continued non-payment of your fine will result in a lien on your property." "I understand," I said calmly. "I'd like to start by presenting evidence that the fine issued against me was unjustified because I complied with all relevant bylaws." I laid out photographs of my sidewalk, time stamped from my phone, showing it completely clear at 6:15 in the morning on the day in question. Then I presented a weather report showing that the snow had stopped at 4:30 that morning, giving me a full 23.5 hours to clear it before the 24-hour deadline passed. "The compliance officer reported snow on your walkway at 2 in the afternoon," Patricia said, reading from a document in front of her. "Then the compliance officer was either mistaken or dishonest, because these photos show otherwise. I'd like to know who the compliance officer is and whether they have any documentation beyond their written report. Did they take photographs? Patricia and Dale exchanged glances. We don't typically require photographic evidence from our compliance officers, Dale said quietly. That seems like a significant oversight, especially when you're issuing fines of several $100s. But let's move on to the larger issue. I pulled out Thomas Keller's spreadsheets and began distributing copies. This document tracks every plowing event in Meadowbrook Hills for the past 2 winters. As you can see, Maple Crest has received an average of 2.3 plowing services per snowfall, while Oakwood Drive has received 0.1 services per snowfall. That 0.1 represents a single time in December when the plow driver apparently made a wrong turn and cleared half the street before leaving. Susan actually laughed at that, then caught herself and tried to hide it with a cough. Streets are prioritized based on safety and traffic volume, Patricia said, repeating her earlier line. According to what standard? I've reviewed the HOA bylaws, the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, and the snow removal section of our community guidelines. None of them mention priority streets. In fact, the contract with the plowing company explicitly states that all streets should receive equal service. I pulled out the contract, which I had finally received from the HOA 3 days earlier after threatening to file a complaint with the Ohio Real Estate Commission. Section 12.4, which I've highlighted, says exactly that. The contract allows for operational flexibility, Patricia said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. Operational flexibility doesn't mean you can funnel services exclusively to streets where board members live while neglecting everyone else. That's a breach of your fiduciary duty to the association members. I pulled out another document. I've also learned that the plowing company, Hendricks Snow Services, is owned by your nephew, Brandon Hendricks. You failed to disclose this conflict of interest when the contract was awarded, and you didn't solicit competitive bids from other companies. Under Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.03, that's a violation of the duty of loyalty you owe to the association. The room went dead silent. Susan was staring at Patricia with her mouth slightly open. Dale had gone pale and was clutching his pen like a lifeline. I don't know where you're getting your information, Patricia said, but her voice had turned icy. But my family relationships are not subject to scrutiny by the association members. They are when they affect your decision-making and result in financial benefit to a family member at the expense of the community. You're essentially funneling HOA funds to your nephew, while ensuring he provides premium services to your street and minimal services to everyone else. That's embezzlement or at least serious mismanagement. This hearing is over, Patricia snapped, standing up abruptly. Your fine stands, and if you don't pay within the next 2 weeks, we'll proceed with placing a lien on your property. Then I'll see you in court, I said, standing as well. Because I'm filing a lawsuit against the HOA for breach of contract, selective enforcement, and violation of fiduciary duty. And I'm filing a complaint with the Ohio Real Estate Commission regarding the conflict of interest and the financial irregularities. I'd also suggest that the other board members might want to consult their own attorneys, because if this turns into a criminal investigation for embezzlement or fraud, you could be held personally liable for failing to exercise proper oversight. Dale actually stood up at that, his face ashen. Criminal investigation. Nobody said anything about criminal activity. I just thought we were hiring a plowing company. Dale, sit down and be quiet, Patricia hissed. No, I'm done being quiet. Patricia, you told us your nephew gave us a good rate. You didn't tell us he was only plowing certain streets. I don't want any part of this." Susan nodded vigorously. "Me neither. I barely even come to these meetings. I just sign what you put in front of me." Patricia looked like she wanted to throttle both of them. "You're both overreacting. This is a simple dispute about snow removal, not some criminal conspiracy." "Then you won't mind if I request a full audit of the HOA's finances for the past 2 years," I said. "I'm particularly interested in how much we're paying Hendrick's Snow Services compared to market rates for similar services, and whether there have been any other contracts awarded to your family members or friends." Patricia grabbed her papers and shoved them into her bag. "This association will not be bullied by frivolous legal threats from a disgruntled resident. You're going to lose, Mr. Thompson, and when you do, we'll seek reimbursement for all legal fees." She stormed out of the room, leaving Dale and Susan sitting at the table looking shell-shocked. I gathered my materials calmly, nodded to the court reporter who was still dutifully typing everything, and left. That evening, I drafted a detailed complaint to the Ohio Real Estate Commission, outlining the conflict of interest, the selective enforcement of plowing services, and the financial irregularities. I also filed a small claims court case against the HOA for the $300 fine, plus documentation fees and the cost of my time. Small claims in Ohio had a limit of $6,000, which was enough for my purposes. Then I did something that turned out to be even more effective. I posted everything on social media. I created a detailed timeline with photos, spreadsheets, and copies of relevant documents with personal information redacted. I shared it to a local Columbus community group, a Ohio HOA horror stories page, and several neighborhood watch forums. Within 24 hours, it had been shared over 1,000 times. The story caught the attention of a local news reporter named Jessica Torres, who worked for the NBC affiliate in Columbus. She called me 2 days after my post went viral and asked if I would be willing to do an interview. "Absolutely," I said. The interview was scheduled for that Friday afternoon. Jessica and her cameraman came to my house and filmed the street, showing the still unplowed conditions even though there had been another snowfall 2 days earlier. They interviewed me in my living room, and I walked them through the entire situation, showing the evidence I had compiled. "What do you want to happen now?" Jessica asked. "I want the HOA to acknowledge they've been mismanaging community funds and providing unequal services. I want the contract with Hendrick's Snow Services terminated and a new company hired through a proper bidding process. I want Patricia Hendricks to resign as president because she's proven she can't be trusted to act in the community's best interests. And I want my fine rescinded, along with all the other unjust fines issued to residents on Oakwood Drive." "Have you heard from the HOA since your hearing?" "Only through their lawyer, who sent me a cease and desist letter demanding I take down my social media posts." I declined. Jessica smiled. "Good for you. We're going to run this story on the evening news tonight and tomorrow. I have a feeling it's going to get a lot of attention." She was right. The story aired on Friday evening, and by Saturday morning, my phone was blowing up with messages from neighbors, friends, and even people I hadn't talked to in years. The HOA's lawyer sent another letter, this one threatening a defamation lawsuit, which was absurd because everything I had said was demonstrably true, and I had documentation to prove it. On Sunday, 4 other news outlets contacted me for follow-up interviews. The story had struck a nerve because almost everyone either lived in an HOA or knew someone who did, and almost everyone had a story about overreach or unfair treatment. My case had become a symbol for a larger frustration with the way some homeowner associations operated. Monday morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a notice that an emergency meeting had been called for that Wednesday evening to discuss recent allegations and operational concerns. All residents were encouraged to attend. The community center was packed. Every chair was filled, and people lined the walls and spilled out into the hallway. I recognized faces from all over the neighborhood, including many people I had never seen at a board meeting before. The local news crews were there too, cameras positioned at the back of the room. Patricia sat at the board table, flanked by Dale and Susan, but the dynamic had clearly changed. Dale and Susan had distanced their chairs slightly from Patricia, and both of them looked miserable. Patricia's face was set in a rigid mask of composure, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. A lawyer sat at the end of the table, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Richard Pemberton, representing the HOA. Patricia called the meeting to order, but before she could get through the preliminaries, Frank Morrison stood up. "Point of order," he said loudly. "Under the association bylaws, residents have the right to call for a vote of no confidence in any board member. I'm formally making that motion regarding Patricia Hendricks." The room erupted in applause and shouts of support. Patricia's face flushed red. "That's not how this works," she said. "A vote of no confidence requires a petition with signatures from at least 20% of the homeowners, submitted in writing at least 14 days before a scheduled meeting." "I have that petition right here," Frank said, pulling out a thick stack of papers. 62 signatures, which is well over the required 20%. I emailed it to the HOA office 16 days ago, and I have the delivery confirmation. Richard Pemberton leaned over to look at the papers, then whispered something to Patricia. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Very well," she said stiffly. "We'll add that to the agenda under new business." "No," said a woman I didn't recognize standing up from the third row. "We're voting now. You've stonewalled and delayed and manipulated procedure long enough. We want you out tonight." More applause and shouts of agreement. Jessica Torres was filming everything, her cameraman panning across the crowd to capture the energy. Richard Pemberton stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen, please. I understand emotions are running high, but we need to follow proper procedure. If a valid petition has been submitted, then the vote will happen tonight as requested. But we need to do this in an orderly fashion." It took another 10 minutes to get everyone settled and to verify the petition signatures. Richard confirmed that the petition was valid, and the vote was scheduled to happen immediately. Patricia would have 15 minutes to defend herself, and then the residents would vote by secret ballot. Patricia's defense was exactly what I expected. A lot of talk about her years of service, her dedication to the community, and how she had always tried to do what was best for everyone. She claimed the plowing issue was a misunderstanding, that she had been trying to save the association money by hiring her nephew who had offered a discounted rate, and that any appearance of preferential treatment was unintentional. "I've given 6 years of my life to this community," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I've attended every meeting, responded to every complaint, and worked tirelessly to maintain property values. If there have been mistakes, they were made in good faith, and I don't deserve to be publicly humiliated like this." Some people looked sympathetic, but most faces remained hard. When Frank stood up to speak in favor of the motion, he was blunt. "Patricia, you didn't make mistakes in good faith. You used your position to benefit your family and yourself while neglecting the rest of us. You issued fines to residents who had done nothing wrong while making sure your own street was plowed twice as much as everyone else's. That's not service. That's corruption, plain and simple. The voting took 45 minutes because of the number of people present. When the results were tallied, 78% had voted in favor of removing Patricia from the board. She sat frozen in her chair, staring at the paper with the results as if she couldn't quite process what had happened. "The motion passes," Richard Pemberton said quietly. "Mrs. Hendricks, you are removed from your position as president and as a member of the board effective immediately. You'll need to turn over all HOA documents and property within 48 hours. Patricia stood up slowly, gathered her things, and walked out of the room without another word. The silence that followed her exit was almost eerie, and then someone started clapping. Within seconds, the entire room had erupted in applause. Dale and Susan looked shell-shocked but relieved. Richard Pemberton explained that a special election would need to be held within 30 days to fill the vacant board position, and in the meantime, Dale would serve as interim president. "I want to start by apologizing," Dale said, standing up with shaking hands. "Susan and I should have been paying more attention to what was going on. We let Patricia run things without proper oversight, and that was wrong. I promise you, that's going to change. First thing tomorrow, I'm terminating the contract with Hendricks Snow Services and putting out requests for bids from at least 3 other companies. We'll also be conducting a full financial audit to make sure there aren't any other problems we don't know about." More applause. Then someone called out, "What about the fines?" Dale nodded. "All fines related to snow removal on Oakwood Drive and any other affected streets are rescinded, effective immediately. We'll be issuing refunds to anyone who already paid. And we're going to review our entire fine process to make sure this kind of selective enforcement doesn't happen again." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't everything I had wanted, but it was close. The board was changing, the corrupt practices were being addressed, and the community was finally paying attention to how things were run. After the meeting ended, dozens of people came up to thank me and shake my hand. Maria Garcia hugged me and said her husband had been following the news coverage from his recliner and cheering. Thomas Keller insisted on buying me a beer sometime. Even people I had never met stopped to say they appreciated what I had done. Jessica Torres interviewed me again outside the community center. "How do you feel about tonight's outcome?" she asked. "Relieved," I said honestly. This was never about me personally. It was about holding people accountable when they abuse their power. Every homeowner in an HOA deserves to be treated fairly and to know that their dues are being used appropriately. I'm glad the community came together to demand better. The story ran again on the late news, and clips of Patricia's removal went viral on social media. Within a week, I had been contacted by homeowner advocacy groups in 3 different states asking if I would share my story at their events. I declined most of them because I just wanted my life to go back to normal, but I did agree to write a detailed guide on how to challenge an HOA, which I posted online for free. The financial audit that Dale ordered turned up additional problems. Patricia had been approving payments to Hendricks Snow Services that were nearly double the market rate for comparable services, and there were several other small contracts that had gone to friends and family members without proper bidding processes. The total amount of misused funds came to approximately $47,000 over the 2-year period. Dale and Susan, on the advice of Richard Pemberton, reported the findings to the Ohio Real Estate Commission and also filed a report with the Columbus Police Department. The investigation took several months, but eventually, Patricia was charged with theft by deception and abuse of position, both felonies under Ohio law. Brandon Hendricks was also charged as a co-conspirator, because investigators found text messages between him and Patricia, where they discussed inflating invoices and splitting the extra money. Apparently, Patricia had been receiving cash payments from Brandon for every contract she steered his way, which he was funding by overcharging the HOA. The case went to trial in October, 9 months after that first yellow envelope appeared in my mailbox. I was called as a witness and testified about the plowing disparities and the fine I had received. The prosecution's case was strong, built on documentary evidence, text messages, and testimony from Denise, the HOA office administrator, who had finally agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. Patricia and Brandon were both convicted. Patricia received a sentence of 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months, plus restitution of the full $47,000. Brandon received 2 years and was also ordered to pay restitution. Both of them had to forfeit any assets that could be traced back to the illegal payments. The HOA underwent massive reforms. A new board was elected, including Frank Morrison as president. They implemented new bylaws requiring competitive bidding for all contracts over $5,000, mandatory disclosure of any conflicts of interest, and a resident oversight committee to review financial statements quarterly. The entire community became much more engaged, and attendance at board meetings went from a handful of people to standing room only for the first year. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my house without the constant stress of dealing with HOA drama. Oakwood Drive was plowed regularly and fairly by a new company that charged reasonable rates and did excellent work. My relationship with my neighbors deepened because we had gone through something difficult together and come out stronger. I never sought recognition for what happened, but the story continued to resonate. A documentary filmmaker contacted me about doing a short film on HOA abuses, using my case as the centerpiece. I agreed, hoping it might help other people in similar situations. The film premiered at a film festival in Cleveland and won an Audience Choice Award. More importantly, my case inspired legislative action. A state representative from the Columbus area introduced a bill requiring greater transparency and oversight for homeowner associations in Ohio. The bill included provisions for mandatory financial audits, disclosure requirements for board members, and an easier process for residents to challenge unfair fines. It passed the state legislature and was signed into law, becoming known informally as the Thompson Act, though the official name was the Ohio Homeowner Association Accountability Act. I attended the signing ceremony at the governor's request, standing in the background as he spoke about the importance of protecting homeowners from abuses of power. It was surreal to think that something that had started with an unfair fine and unplowed streets had turned into actual legal reform. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had just paid that first $300 fine and moved on with my life. Part of me wishes I could have avoided the stress and the confrontation and the months of uncertainty. But a bigger part of me knows that staying silent would have been wrong. Patricia would have continued abusing her position, more residents would have been victimized, and the culture of corruption would have persisted. Standing up to injustice, even in something as seemingly mundane as a homeowner association dispute, matters. It matters because every small abuse of power, if left unchallenged, paves the way for larger abuses. It matters because communities function best when everyone is treated fairly and held to the same standards. And it matters because ordinary people have more power than they realize when they are willing to demand accountability. The yellow envelope that started everything now sits in a frame on my office wall, a reminder of how quickly things can escalate and how important it is to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Below it, I've mounted a copy of the news article about Patricia's conviction and a photograph of the community center packed with residents demanding change. My sidewalk is always shoveled now, clear and safe within hours of any snowfall. But more importantly, I know that if I ever receive another unjust fine or notice another instance of favoritism or corruption, I won't hesitate to speak up. And I know that my community will back me up, because we've learned that silence enables wrongdoing and that collective action can create real change. The experience taught me something valuable about American civic life. The systems we have for holding leaders accountable only work if people are willing to use them. HOA, local governments, school boards, and other institutions rely on public apathy to operate without scrutiny. When residents engage, ask questions, demand transparency, and refuse to accept injustice, even the most entrenched power structures can be reformed. I still live in Meadowbrook Hills, and I plan to stay here for the foreseeable future. The neighborhood is different now, better in ways that go beyond plowed streets and fair enforcement of bylaws. People know each other better. We look out for one another, and we pay attention to how our community is run. The HOA is no longer something that happens to us, but something we actively participate in shaping. Every winter, when the first snow falls and I hear the rumble of the plow truck making its rounds through the neighborhood, I feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. Oakwood Drive gets plowed at the same time as every other street. No favoritism, no special treatment, just fair and equal service for everyone who pays their dues. And every time I check my mailbox and find nothing but ordinary mail, no yellow envelopes with unjust fines, I'm reminded that the fight was worth it. Not just for me, but for everyone who has ever felt powerless against a system that seemed rigged against them. Change is possible. Justice is achievable. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to say that enough is enough and to keep saying it until others join in. The community center where Patricia was removed from power now hosts regular events. Movie nights, holiday parties, and quarterly town halls where residents can voice concerns and participate in decision-making. Frank Morrison, as the new president, has an open-door policy and actually responds to emails and phone calls. The Transparency Committee publishes financial reports online every month, and anyone can access them with a simple login. These might seem like small victories, but they represent a fundamental shift in how power operates in our little corner of suburban Ohio. The residents are no longer subjects to be managed and fined, but stakeholders with real input and genuine oversight. That transformation, born from a dispute over snow plowing and an unjust fine, proved more valuable than anyone could have anticipated. On the anniversary of that first yellow envelope, I hosted a barbecue in my backyard and invited everyone from Oakwood Drive. We stood around the grill, eating burgers and telling stories, and someone proposed a toast to standing up for what's right. We raised our glasses and laughed about how something as mundane as snow removal had turned into a community revolution. Maria Garcia's husband, his back fully healed, told everyone about watching the news coverage and feeling proud to live on a street with people who wouldn't back down. Thomas Keller showed off the latest version of his plowing spreadsheet, now maintained as an official community document to ensure the new contractor was meeting service standards. Jennifer Wu announced she was running for the board in the next election because she had been inspired to get more involved. As the evening wore on, and the sun set over the neighborhood, I looked around at these people who had become more than neighbors. They had become friends and allies. We had fought together for something important and won, not just for ourselves, but for the principle that power must be exercised fairly and transparently. The story of Meadowbrook Hills spread far beyond Columbus. I received messages from homeowners in California, Texas, Florida, and even Alaska, telling me about their own battles with overreaching HOAs and asking for advice. I tried to help where I could, sharing the strategies that had worked for me and connecting people with resources and lawyers who specialized in homeowner association law. Some of those cases ended in victory, with corrupt board members removed and reforms implemented. Others ended in frustration and defeat, with residents ultimately choosing to move rather than continue fighting. But every person who stood up and challenged unjust treatment made a difference, even if the immediate outcome wasn't what they hoped for. They planted seeds of resistance that might bloom later, and they showed others that acquiescence isn't the only option. The Thompson Act, the Ohio law inspired by my case, became a model for similar legislation in other states. Within 2 years, 5 other states had passed comparable laws requiring greater HOA transparency and accountability. The movement for homeowner rights gained momentum, and national advocacy organizations began coordinating efforts to push for reform at both state and federal levels. I never intended to become a spokesperson for anything, but I found myself caring deeply about the issue and the people affected by HOA abuses. I started a blog where I shared information about homeowner rights, reviewed state laws, and highlighted particularly egregious cases of HOA overreach. The blog attracted thousands of regular readers and became a resource for people looking for guidance and support. My career in software engineering continued, but I began dedicating my free time to this cause. I testified at state legislative hearings in Ohio and neighboring states, explaining from personal experience why reforms were necessary. I helped organize a national conference on homeowner association accountability, bringing together lawyers, activists, legislators, and affected residents to share strategies and build networks. The conference was held in Chicago on a rainy weekend in November, 2 years after my initial confrontation with Patricia Hendricks. More than 300 people attended, and the energy in the room was electric. Everyone had a story, some were worse than mine, involving foreclosures, harassment, and even physical threats from vindictive board members. But there was also hope and determination, a shared conviction that these institutions could and should be made to serve the communities they were created to protect. I gave the opening keynote speech, telling the full story of what had happened in Meadowbrook Hills. When I described the moment when Patricia was voted out and the community center erupted in applause, many people in the audience clapped along, recognizing the catharsis of that victory. When I talked about the criminal convictions and the passage of reform legislation, people took notes furiously, seeing a roadmap for their own efforts. After the speech, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. Her name was Willow Reynolds, and she was from Phoenix. Her HOA had foreclosed on her house over unpaid fines that she claimed were illegitimate, issued because she had filed a complaint about the board president's harassment. She had lost her home, her savings, and nearly her will to fight. "Your story gave me hope," she said. "I'm appealing the foreclosure, and I'm using the arguments you made about selective enforcement and breach of fiduciary duty. My lawyer thinks we have a good chance." I gave her my contact information and connected her with Margaret Chen, my lawyer, who had experience with foreclosure cases. 6 months later, Willow sent me an email with the subject line, "We won." The foreclosure had been reversed. She had gotten her house back, and the board members responsible were facing civil penalties. She had also inspired other residents in her community to demand accountability, and the entire board had been replaced in a special election. Stories like Willow's kept me going through the difficult moments, when the fight seemed endless and the opposition seemed too powerful. Every victory, large or small, validated the belief that ordinary people could make extraordinary changes when they refused to accept injustice. Back in Meadowbrook Hills, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA functioned smoothly under Frank's leadership, with genuine input from residents and transparent operations. Property values had actually increased because the neighborhood had gained a reputation for being well-managed and community-oriented. Prospective buyers saw the news coverage and the reforms as positives, signs of an engaged and healthy community rather than a troubled one. Patricia Hendricks was released from prison after serving 16 months, her sentence reduced for good behavior. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to Kentucky to live with her daughter and had no plans to return to Columbus. Brandon had served his full sentence and was working construction, his plowing business dissolved and his reputation ruined. I felt no satisfaction in their punishment, only a sense that justice had been served, and that the system, however slowly and imperfectly, had worked. The point had never been vengeance but accountability and reform, ensuring that what happened couldn't happen again. As winter approached each year, I found myself watching the first snowfall with a mix of nostalgia and vigilance. The plows always came through reliably now, clearing Oakwood Drive with the same attention and care as every other street in the neighborhood. But I never took that fairness for granted, knowing how easily it could be lost if people stopped paying attention. The yellow envelope in my office remained a daily reminder of how quickly ordinary life can be disrupted by injustice, and how important it is to stand up when that disruption occurs. It had been a simple piece of paper, a routine administrative action by someone who had believed herself untouchable. But it had sparked a chain of events that exposed corruption, reformed an institution, inspired legislation, and built a movement. I often thought about what would have happened if I had been different, less stubborn, less willing to fight, more inclined to just pay the fine and move on. Patricia would still be president, her nephew would still be overcharging the HOA, and residents would still be receiving unjust fines while watching their streets go unplowed. The corruption would have continued, perhaps escalating, until some crisis forced a reckoning. But I wasn't different, and the crisis happened when it needed to, before things got even worse. And in the end, the community was stronger for having gone through it. We had learned that we had power, that we could demand better, and that accountability was not just an abstract principle but a practical necessity for fair governance. Years from now, when new residents move into Meadowbrook Hills, they probably won't know the full story of what happened. They'll benefit from the reforms and the culture of transparency, but they might take it for granted the way people often do with rights and protections won by previous generations. That's okay. The point wasn't to be remembered but to make things better. But for those of us who lived through it, who stood in that packed community center and voted to remove a corrupt president, who watched justice slowly grind forward through investigations and trials, who saw legislative reform turn our local fight into broader change, the memory will always be vivid. We will always know that we faced injustice and didn't look away, that we demanded accountability and didn't give up until we got it. And if I ever see another yellow envelope in my mailbox, Another unjust fine or arbitrary rule or instance of selective enforcement, I'll know exactly what to do. I'll document everything, research the relevant laws, gather support from neighbors, and fight back with every tool available. Because I've learned that ordinary citizens have extraordinary power when they choose to use it, and that no institution, no matter how entrenched, is immune to accountability when people demand it. The snow falls every winter in Columbus, covering sidewalks and streets in that familiar blanket of white. And every winter, the plows come through, clearing the roads fairly and efficiently, serving all residents equally regardless of who they are or which street they live on. It's a simple thing, really, snow removal, but it represents something much larger. The principle that everyone deserves fair treatment, that rules should be applied equally, and that those in power must be held accountable for their actions. That principle, tested and proven on the streets of Meadowbrook Hills, is the foundation of every just community and every democratic society. It's worth defending, worth fighting for, and worth celebrating when it prevails. And it all started with a yellow envelope, and the decision to say no to injustice. One ordinary citizen standing up in one suburban neighborhood on one cold January morning, refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they were.